pass the test. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Most of you are here. Ronan, would you open the door and just see if there are stragglers there? The fan club is immense for these ladies who are going to, thank you, sit because they could spend all day with you, and they might because they're so kind. You may take the chairs. Fiona, right all the way close to me, please. Masha, you're in the middle, if I may, so call you for the moment, and Jill. So, ladies and gentlemen, who knew that 3:30 p.m. Thursday is prime time? Yeah, that's right. In honor of Jill Doughtery, I'm reverting to my old ways and doing a stand-up, not because I like it, but because I thought, I'm so sick of that darn metal podium that gets in the way of at least half the audience, and you need to see them. I will disappear, and Fiona won't be in my shadow, and I'm really not even close to being in her shadow. They don't need much of an introduction. I will get to it very briefly in a moment, but I do need to recognize our oldest and founding member, the Foreign Policy Association of New York, which, as many of you know, produces the Great Decisions booklet and video every year since the mid-50s as a community resource, and they are widely dispersed in council land and beyond. And in the 2023 edition, one of the topics is, what is a war crime? War crimes, what is a war crime? How does this definition apply to the recent events in Ukraine? Russia's invasion of Ukraine has resulted in widespread charges of war crimes and calls for justice. And how does this happen in international law, and how are these crimes punished, if at all? This is but one topic that this panel will undertake, I'm sure. As you know from our agenda, Iran and nuclear warfare, weapons and non-proliferation, Sandro Gozzi's comments about transatlantic relations, averting a fourth or fifth Taiwan Strait crisis. Of course, our luncheon keynote speaker, who I know is here, but General Levine, where are you again so we can spot you? There he is, talked a lot about this issue of Ukraine and Russia. And we have truly the best in the business who know about it here on this panel. This was actually, some of you know that this was intentionally the first panel I reached out to be our opening dinner thing. We couldn't quite get it along. We always get flexible, and they were willing to rise to the occasion of primetime. So, just this way, Fiona Hill is a senior fellow in the Center for the United States and Europe program, foreign policy program at Brookings. She was deputy assistant and responsible for European affairs for President Trump for a couple of years at the National Security Council. Her book is Lessons from the Edge. Ambassador, I'm sorry, is There Is Nothing for You Here? Yes. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch's book is Lessons from the Edge, and she is a incredibly decorated, distinguished diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service for over 3 decades, I think, and has a triple ambassadorship to Kyrgyz Republic, Armenia, and most famously, Ukraine. This is the first time in person that these two ladies have appeared together. They've done Zooms, they've been on television, but we are extraordinarily privileged to have this thing. It's almost a little over the 2-year anniversary that sequentially they appeared in some very controversial and important hearings where they emerged heroically. I had the pleasure of being in the audience in spring of 2020 at Georgetown, when the Trainer Excellence Award in the Conduct of Diplomacy was presented to Ambassador Yovanovitch, and all the luminaries of U.S. foreign policy, Tom Pickering, Bill Burns, and many, many others, said the most fabulous things of this very deserving individual. Jill Doughtery is a global fellow at the Wilson Center. She was, for 30-so years, CNN's foreign affairs correspondent and had many roles based in Washington, D.C. She brings incredible experience and expertise on Russia and the former Soviet Union as well. So, ladies, take it away.
Thank you very much, Bill. Really appreciate it. Indeed, this is the A-team. So, and I think you're the A-team audience because you're the people who are really deeply interested in the subject, and really, really glad to be here and glad to see some friends from Seattle, World Affairs Council, and others whom I've seen, Minneapolis, all over the place. So it's great to have you here. And I just want to make sure, we've got roughly an hour, but we're going to have Q&A. Is that correct, for maybe 20 minutes? I know I'm sure you'll have some questions. So I've been thinking about this for quite a while, how we could approach this discussion. And I think the dilemma is, the title is Ukraine, Russia, and the War Over the World Order. So what we have right now is, I think you'd have to say, the world order being questioned, revised, I'm not quite sure what, but you have the immediate situation in Ukraine, and then you have the implications for the countries involved, and then you have the bigger picture. What is this world order? Was there actually a world order when this started? And do we have any type of world order right now? So it's kind of micro and macro. And I think we'll bounce between both as we go along. But we're not going to have any opening statements. I'd rather just jump right into it. So thinking, excuse me, of the first question to me would be, when we're talking about things changing immediately on the ground, just a couple of days ago, we have 2 missiles that land in Poland. And there is massive confusion, or at least it appeared that way, at the beginning. Could they be Russian missiles? Did Russia attack Poland, which, of course, we all know is a member of NATO? Or then there was kind of a careful approach, and I was reporting on this. Actually, I was doing a live shot for CNN when this happened, and I started thinking, wouldn't be surprising, but it doesn't make sense. And then the Biden administration was pretty careful about their statements, and then we find out that it wasn't Russia. It was actually apparently errant defensive missiles from Ukraine. But we really came, I would say, close to the brink with that. And maybe we start with that pretty dramatic moment. Masha, perhaps we'll start with you. Yeah. When you heard the news, and you have such experience in this field with your time in Ukraine as our ambassador, what went through your mind, and how did you try to understand what was going on? Where did you first go, and how did you deal with that?
So probably like everybody else in this room, I was like, oh no, because this is something that we've been worrying about for a long time, and nobody wants to see a widened war, right? Not with the US, not with NATO, certainly not with Poland. But that was kind of, where my mind was going. But then I was reminded, in part by people like you on TV, that, facts first. It's really important to know what happened before when Russia's in with strong statements and, these are the 5 things we're going to do. I mean, maybe you have, somebody pulling those plans of these are the 5 things we're going to do, but you don't put that all out there publicly. Facts first. It's really important. Early in my career, I worked for a guy named Henry Caddo, who was the spokesperson for DOD for a number of years. And he would, whenever there was something happening, he would say, the first 2 or 3 reports are always wrong. Right. Let's not get ahead of our skis. And I think, one of the things that I found really heartening in this, rather dramatic and concerning episode is that world leaders did not get You know, they were cautious, they were prudent, and they waited for the facts to come in. And I think that's what we need at a time of, you know, great stress and peril in the world.
Masha, I know I want to ask
Yeah,
Fiona the
please.
same question, but President Zelensky of Ukraine did kind of get ahead of his skis on that one,
Yeah.
correct? I mean, he said, we've got to do something, and he blamed it on Russia. So how do you interpret that?
I don't really know what was going through his head, but I think that, you know, I think President Zelensky has been a remarkable leader for Ukraine and really for the free world in terms of how he's leading Ukraine and leading based on principle and energizing not only his own people but the world to this cause, which is a cause for all of us. But I think, you know, he is, shall we say, not super experienced. This was obviously a moment of great stress, and perhaps he did get a little bit ahead of himself. But he has now, you know, moderated his statements. In fact, I think everybody agrees at this point, at least, that it was a Russian missile. It was just apparently one that went up, you know, from the Ukrainian side as they were trying to hit Russian missiles that were attacking Ukraine.
A defensive system.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And Fiona, what went through your mind? Let's say, you know, you're back at the NSC. What goes through your mind?
Well, actually, I mean, obviously the same things as Masha just said there too, to be very cautious about what's actually happening. And I did get a whole host of phone calls from media outlets basically saying, what's your reaction? Well, I don't actually know what's happened. And we need to have a full investigation. Now, often those investigations take a long time. I mean, if you think back to MH17, the tragedy of the Malaysian Airlines, it's only actually just now that we've had the prosecution, in absentia, of course, of the Russian servicemen who perpetrated this, you know, by, you know, basically doing the targeting just today. That's a long time. So, I mean, one would hope that actually these investigations move along with a little bit more speed than this. But it's certainly, you know, the case that it does take time to do quite a lot of investigations. And as, you know, Masha is saying here, you know, the S-300's defensive system, which Ukraine has, those are Russian-made, so it would be obvious then, first you would see it's a Russian missile, but it's being, you know, used in a defensive context by the Ukrainians. And then you've got to kind of figure out through telemetry and, you know, whole investigation of the site of exactly what's happened. But the obvious thing is that Ukraine was defending itself from a barrage of attacks. I mean, we know that Ukraine's being swarmed by these kamikaze drones, all coming in from Iran. We've also been trying to collect information about the provenance of all these drones, because Iran, of course, has denied supplying Russia with drones, but there's plenty of them now littering the battlefield. So in each instance, we have to collect information. And at the very beginning of the introduction, Bill talked about war crimes. And it's important for all of these, for attribution, to collect the information and to get as much technical detail about what's happened, to then be able to make determinations. And I'm sure from the perspective of President Zelensky, you know, this is the fog of war. This is, he's always having to react to everything that's happening at the same time. And when he says it's Russia's fault, of course it is. Russia invaded. And it's Russia that has put Ukraine at such peril and jeopardy by this constant, devastating bombardment. And, you know, we see this in many other wars. If you think about the war or the civil war in Syria, there was an instance where the Syrians shot down a Russian plane, and the Russians blamed the Israelis because there'd been an Israeli jet in that location beforehand, and Israel wasn't us, you know, we didn't shoot you down. But we did have an incident where the Turks shot down a Russian plane that strayed into Turkish airspace across Syria, causing a lot of let's just say, political upheaval after that as well, including a real back and forth between Turkey and Russia over that before it got sorted out. So time and time again, we see incidents like this happening. And it's one of the reasons why we should be paying so much attention, as Masha is saying, to this conflict and to the dangers of it.
Yeah. And the dangers, sometimes, as we just pointed out, a mistake, you know, an accident, but accidents can turn into major problems, and especially nuclear issues, but we can get into that a little bit later. You know, Masha, I was interested. I love your socks, by the way.
Yes,
think they're very,
I wore them
I don't know
especially
whether
for
you
you
can
guys.
actually see the yellow and blue socks.
Here, I will
yeah.
just demonstrate. I have yellow and blue socks on,
Yeah.
and they say, and this
Really?
is always my message to all audiences, be brave like Ukraine.
Yeah, I have a nice sticker for that for the back of the telephone that you can all get online as well. I've got it on the back of my phone.
Well, they're fabulous. But, you know, as we're looking at the reality on the ground, I know we're all looking at the human side of it, not just the geopolitical, but the human. And right now, we have the infrastructure, heating, electric, and any type of energy, sometimes water, being destroyed in a vicious campaign by Russia. So, Masha, you know, you've been on the ground so many times. You were there for a long time. How are people going to get through the winter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say it's probably, for many people, it's going to be day by day what they're going to be doing. And while the beginning of this barrage in early October really kind of hardened the Ukrainians. I mean, they were, you know, I think Russian intent was to break Ukrainian spirit, but what it did was to anger Ukraine and make them more defiant, and that they were going to, you know, last this one out, and they were going to show the Russians. But, you know, winter can be brutal in Ukraine. We've had the first snow today, I believe, and it's very, very cold. And for those of you who have ever sat through a power outage, it gets colder when it's dark also. And I mean, imagine if you're a mom with 2 kids and you have to go up, you know, 14 flights of stairs because the elevator isn't working, with all of your groceries and probably water too, because the water isn't reliable anymore. And you know, there's an issue with sewage as well, so what do you do for that? And then you get up to your apartment, which is cold and dark and miserable, and there's no way to cook your family a meal. So I think reality is, to a certain extent, setting in, but I will tell you that my friends are defiant, and they are trying to figure out how they can stay, how they can make it work. A lot of people have decamped to their dachas outside of Kiev, outside of the bigger cities, where you can make do with firewood, you maybe don't need as much electricity, et cetera. They are trying to figure out how to make it work. Other people are thinking about, you know, returning, you know, going back to Poland, going back to places in Western Europe, although people don't want to do that. They want to stay home, which is Ukraine, and they want to fight and defend their country. But it is difficult, and it will only get more difficult before it gets easier.
Fiona, when we look at this bombing campaign, the question I keep asking myself is, why is Putin doing this? Because it is, obviously he wants to, you know, decimate a lot of Ukraine in order to defeat them. But this almost looks like, maybe the word overkill isn't appropriate, but he is viciously destroying and leveling everything in sight. So what is his rationale? Why is he doing this?
I think it's very clear intent. If he can't have Ukraine, he wants to destroy it. And he's doing, you know, what we already saw Russia do internally in Chechnya, when they laid waste to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. I mean, you covered that. I mean, I was there in that period as well, and, you know, it looked like the bombed-out shell of cities all the way around Europe after World War II. And in fact, Chechnya was the largest military action on Russian soil after World War II, and the largest military action in Europe after World War II, until, you know, we end up in Ukraine. In terms of just this kind of mass bombing campaign and the leveling of cities, although we obviously saw a lot of horrific things in the Balkans as well during, you know, the whole collapse of Yugoslavia and the post-Yugoslav wars. But this is deliberate. I mean, in many respects, it's medieval, but that's also deliberate. It's kind of like, it's what empires do. You know, if they can't, you know, subjugate politically, they go in and destroy to teach a lesson. Because this is a lesson for all of us from Putin as well, and for everybody else around in the former Soviet states in Europe and globally, that Putin means business. And if Ukrainians deny that they are Russians, and part of that larger Russian world and Russian civilization, which is looking under question when you do something like this, then Putin's going to kind of show what happens when you deny that. I mean, that's actually this whole, I mean, a lot of people have been very puzzled about why would Putin call Ukrainians Nazis? Because, I mean, clearly they're not Nazis. There's no National Socialism. This is not, some sort of rerun of World War II. But what he's trying to do is draw a link, with the infamous Stepan Bandera and the parties in Ukraine who fought against Soviet rule because they didn't want to be Soviets, or they didn't want to be part of that dominant ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking group within the Soviet Union. And so he's basically trying to say that, because people are denying their inherent Russianness, therefore they are Nazis, they are radical nationalists. So again, he's trying to make that link that people who fight against Russia, fight against the Russian Imperium, ought to be destroyed. I mean, it's simple, brutal, and horrific. And it's, we were hoping this wasn't of the 21st century. But, for Putin, he's making a point. And he's telling Ukraine that, I don't care how much you try to prevail here. I can destroy you. I did actually want to say, though, one thing in relation to what Masha said here as well, is we can help the Ukrainians through the winter. We have lots of experience of dealing with, instead of Putin-made disasters, natural disasters. And, our militaries and other humanitarian organizations going in and organizing in devastated places. So we could get in portable generators and for heating. We could get in, of course, we see the World Central Kitchen, Jose Andres, doing amazing things. They've already been doing that on the borders of Ukraine for feeding people on a large scale. There's lots of things that we actually can do. It's a logistics issue. And I know that, some of our colleagues in the military, this is what militaries do all of the time. So we can help the Ukrainians get through this winter, as well as helping others in Europe, who might be set by, energy shortages and outages as well. We can do this.
Can I just add one other thing to what Fiona said? So why is he doing this? He's doing this now because Russia is losing.
Yeah.
The Russians have figured out, finally, that they cannot actually beat the Ukrainian military. And so they are going after civilians, they are going after civilian infrastructure. It is brutal and, takes us back to, all of the horrible ways that Russians over the many centuries have fought their wars. I mean, not only, raping and pillaging, literally, but deporting millions of Ukrainians, some families, some adults, but also children who are now being adopted by Russian families who will never know that they have a family in Ukraine that loves them and that they themselves are Ukrainian. It is, I don't know if it's a war crime or a crime against humanity to come back to our where we started, but it is something where the Russians need to be held accountable for these kinds of crimes. Because they are, it's Russia unbounded by any kind of principle. I mean, even war, there is the law of war and how militaries are supposed to behave. And Russia has even transgressed those boundaries.
I think it's important to talk about the implications of this war, or how it is affecting the entire world. I mean, militarily, economically, energy, geopolitically, and food. And food has become a huge issue. I mean, even in the United States, we have inflation, and in the developing world is really being hit by this. Recently, as you had the boycott of the ports, and they could not get grain out to the world. Ukraine is a very big supplier of grain and food to the world. So I did note, I was trying to think, is there any good, positive thing to our discussion today? And one would be the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So this is, I'm sure as we discuss it, feel free to fill in the blanks, but essentially, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and the UN, I guess, right?
Yes, the United Nations, under the offices of the Secretary General, under Gutierrez, directly.
So they finally came to this agreement to stop blocking the ports and to let out grain around the world. And that deal, finally, Russia was constantly saying that it was pulling out or it found some problem with the agreement, but now that has been extended. Not quite sure, it's not indefinitely.
120 days.
120 days divided by 3, 30, okay. But it has been extended. So, Masha, back to you. I mean, here's another direct, effect on people on the ground, but it affects everybody in the world. Yeah. So, what is this? Do you think this will hold? And why has Russia been so adamant about not extending it?
Well, I think, and I'd just like to make the point that, as always, the ones who are suffering the most are the most vulnerable. Yeah. And, that is the tragedy of this war, as with so many other wars. I'd like to think that it would hold. I think that Russia has felt bruised, that the Ukrainians are successful militarily, and so they have been able to reach in, with our assistance, but they've been able to reach into the Black Sea Fleet and, bloodied the Russian nose and done a couple other things. And it's important to remember that one of Russia's aims in all of this is to make the Black Sea, which is an international area bounded by, I think, 6 or 7 countries, many of them NATO members, they want to make that a Russian lake. They have fairly successfully done that with the Sea of Azov, and now they are trying to extend that influence into the Black Sea. So this is an issue of pride, but also of power. And it's one that, I think has been a goal of Putin's for, his period in office, but it's also a centuries-long quest to have a warm sea port, warm water port, excuse me. And obviously Crimea is that place. So I'm hoping that it will, this agreement will be, kind of automatically renewed without too much drama, but I wouldn't place too much money on that, because I think Russia's modus operandi is to create problems. So whatever, and try to create leverage that way, and then when Russia finally does agree to re-extend the grain exporting deal, wanting to get credit for doing what it should have been doing all along. I mean, this is classic Russian behavior, and it's not very constructive.
I totally agree, because I used to, when I was reporting from there, I used to say, Putin is the fireman. He's a fire starter. He's the arsonist who starts the fire and then comes in and puts it out and says, "Look what I did! I put out the fire." Truly, this is behavior, very specific behavior by Putin.
Can I just add one other point on this? So the Russians, as we all know, are masters at disinformation. And so what they have said about, the food crisis in the world is they have gone around Africa, the Middle East, other countries, and they've said, "Oh, it's so terrible. It's all because of the sanctions." When we know that is not true, but they are able to manipulate the truth and, put it in there, and that's now, perceived as the truth in many countries of the world. And the Russians also are very active diplomatically in these countries, far more active than we are, which is a whole nother set of issues. But you would think that Russia would get a black eye for trying to manipulate food, but they are very adept at turning the tables.
Yeah. Fiona, boy, there's so much to talk about, and I'm watching the clock because I know you want to ask questions. But I think we have to talk about, will there be negotiations? Can this be ended by negotiations? Right now, in this city, we have warring groups of Russia experts who are saying, it's internecine warfare on K Street, where people are saying, yes, we should definitely negotiate. It's time. I mean, we love the Ukrainians, but we should really negotiate. And then others saying, no way, we will not, it's definitely not time. And if we do it, Putin would just move the goalpost or stall for time. So, Fiona, can I put you on the spot and say, wait, is it time to negotiate? Where do we go?
No, it's not time to negotiate. And it's because of all of this leverage. I mean, Putin is doing whatever he can at the moment to basically push Ukraine and everyone into a corner to negotiate away Ukraine. And his idea of a compromise, the basis for negotiation, is exactly as Masha's laid it out on the grain front, which is to give away something that he's taken that doesn't belong to Russia in the first instance. Every negotiation at this point means a loss for Ukraine and again for Russia. I mean, even notwithstanding the horrors of the destruction and the enormous number of casualties that Russia itself has accrued here too. I mean, General Milley and others talking about 100,000 Russian casualties in terms of deaths and soldiers taken off the battlefield, not to mention the economic and other kind of long-term effects that Russia is going to suffer here. But what Putin is basically saying is, right, I've got Crimea, I've now got Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, and we can negotiate over the borders of what I've got. And he's also leveraging grain. I mean, if you think back in 1985, the Soviet Union had to import grain. It was a massive grain importer, despite the size of the Ukrainian and then Russian and Kazakh grain fields. I actually wrote an essay I discovered, I found this when I visited home recently, in 1985 at school about the Soviet grain crisis. I've forgotten that one. We should rub it out again. It wasn't very good, So it was in high school, so it was really not good. But it was very funny to kind of think that, we had this, did my mic go off?
It just went off.
It just went off.
Any?
Are back on again?
There
I was saying this
good.
word,
Here we
Soviet
are.
grain crisis, was some kind of code word. Soviet grain crisis. I'll say that again. What happens? Yeah, exactly. But it was amazing to sort of think further on that we're in a different grain crisis, but it's now because Russia is such a huge producer, as is in Ukraine, and Putin was looking to leverage that too. Gas, oil, nuclear weapons, devastation. Putin's a kind of a full-service manipulator and leverager of chaos here. And what he's hoping is, as a result of everybody realizing, the kind of consequences and where this is headed, that we could be, that we're in a global war, that we're, in terms of the effects of this, is that everyone's going to put pressure on Ukraine to capitulate. So it's always important to have dialogue, and we've seen Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, and many others going and talking to their Russian counterparts, General Milley talking to his counterpart. We absolutely have to have that. But if you're having a negotiation, it's when both sides are actually prepared to negotiate over something. And Putin is just trying to negotiate away Ukraine at this point. That is not the framework for a negotiation. And it's also not a framework if we have it basically pushed by, we've got to avoid nuclear war at all costs. Because the only person who's threatening nuclear war, or let's just say detonating a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, so not a nuclear war, but using a nuclear weapon in a wartime scenario, is Vladimir Putin. There's been no change in the global strategic nuclear balance, apart from what Putin's doing to it, which is, is basically destabilizing it and saying to the rest of the world, if you want to protect yourself, you want to bully your neighbor, get a nuclear weapon. I mean, he's doing, kind of the best possible advertisement that he possibly could now for weapons proliferation. And we have to curb all of that. So, I think the administration, for now is doing absolutely the right thing, which is saying we will only, help Ukraine to have a negotiation with Russia when the timing is right. And I do think that around Europe, and elsewhere, there is an understanding of that. But you're absolutely right, Jill. There are many, I think, would-be interlocutors right now, from the Pope, for example, to Erdogan and others who actually have their own interests here, who want to frame negotiations. UAE, the Saudis have offered. There's all kinds of would-be interlocutors here, but they've all got their own interests. And getting back to the Black Sea, yes, Russia would like it to be a lake, a Russian lake, but Erdogan and Turkey have a lot of claims here. In fact, remember, the first Crimean War was fought over dominance of the Black Sea, when the Ottoman Empire was weak, and of course Russia was rolled back then. And I think one of the risks is that Erdogan's trying to negotiate with Russia right now to make a kind of condominium in the Black Sea. And I mean, that's also a risk as well. I mean, this war has got a lot of complexity to it. And we have to bear that in mind, that it's not just as simple as getting the Ukrainians and the Russians together to figure things out.
Yeah.
And I would add that Russia doesn't actually want to negotiate with Ukraine.
No.
Russia wants to negotiate with the U.S. And, the Biden administration has been very clear and very strong that, it's Ukraine that will negotiate when it is ready. One of the things that, we used to say when we were in government is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Here.
So, you know, and the Ukrainians know that. I mean, Zelensky has, you know, he said, I don't want a Minsk Agreement 3, because with the first two Minsk agreements, you know, basically, Russia got to keep the lands that it occupied illegally, and there was this ceasefire, kinda, although Russia never.
Oops.
Yeah, again, we're being hacked.
Oh,
Hello?
definitely.
Although,
We lost the mic again.
No, it's come back on, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is
Can
it
you hear
back
me?
again?
Yeah.
Okay. Although Russia never really observed the ceasefire either. And so, you know, when the Ukrainians look back at that, and that was a time when international parties wanting to do the right thing to help Ukraine and staunch the flow of blood, it did put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to negotiate. And I think we're all looking back at that and going, you know, maybe that wasn't the right thing to do, because it's ended us up in where we are today.
You know, I semi-put Fiona on the spot, so I'll put you on the spot, Masha, which is the question, you know, after all the blood, sweat, and tears that Ukraine has shed so far, should it be a member of NATO?
Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, I mean, I can answer the question with my head, and I can answer the question with my heart. You know, my heart says yes, Ukraine should be a member of NATO for all the reasons that you just said, 3 really good reasons. And frankly, if Ukraine were a member of NATO, it would be one of the more capable members of NATO. I mean, and I think we've all seen that in fact as well. But my head says that, you know, that would be a really tough negotiation, and I'm not talking about the Russians now. I'm talking about other member countries. I'm just not sure, certainly today, or, you know, next year, or in 5 years, I'm just not sure when other member countries would be ready for Ukraine to join NATO.
Can I add something on this, though? Because I think what's really important to bear in mind is that the European Union has done something really quite amazing here by extending out the prospect now of membership to Ukraine, which is, you know, quite extraordinary. I mean, I think, you know, we all of this began, in many respects, not all of it began, but some of this began with Ukraine's bid for an association agreement with the European Union. And one would never have imagined that to get fast-tracked towards membership was only supposed to be a perspective, which is, you know, a bit similar to the offer in 2008 to have an open door to NATO, which really wasn't much of a perspective for membership. So the European Union will transform Ukraine. It will help Ukraine, you know, rebuild into the future. And I was just on a session with the European Parliament this morning on Zoom, where they're all talking about Ukraine as part of Europe. And Ukraine now following the path that Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic and Slovakia and many other countries have now followed. And Finland and others that have got their freedom from, you know, the collapse of empires and have taken a long time to become part of the, you know, the community of European nations, but that, you know, Ukraine is now fully seen as that, which of course it should have been over the last 30 years of independence, but, you know, it's actually got there. The NATO issue, I think, at this particular juncture, would feed right into the narrative that, again, Putin is very effectively spreading elsewhere, that this is a proxy war between the United States and Russia and the United States and its bloc, NATO. I mean, I do think that the decision of Finland and Sweden to join NATO shows that this isn't just some American-dominated bloc, and this is actually something that countries, after, in the case of Sweden and Finland, decades of neutrality, that countries want to join for their own mutual defense. This is an alliance. It's not just something that's dominated and dictated to by the United States. But the idea of Ukraine being in there would feed in at this, you know, particular juncture again to all of the propaganda that Putin has been, you know, basically propagating all over the place. Certainly, you know, it has, as you said earlier, had some effect, particularly on the sanctions issue, again, in Africa and Latin America and Asia, where paradoxically Russia is seen still as the leader of the non-aligned movement and the anti-colonialist, you know, movement, even though, you know, Russia is an empire. But it was just never an empire in Africa and Latin America and parts of Asia, though it did take up quite a lot of territory from China that, you know, never bothers to mention. But in any case, it's managed to quite effectively spin this idea that it's fighting against Western imperialism and capitalism still, in so many places of the world, back to the old days.
Exactly, it's the same thing. But I know we have to get questions, but I have to ask very quick. So let's have a 2-minute answer from each of you. But personalities, I work in TV sometime, so personalities, of course, matter. And Putin and Zelensky. So let's take Putin, Fiona. What is his situation right now? How stable is his presidency? And how do you think this is going to affect his ability to rule Russia? 2 minutes.
Well, look, Putin still thinks he can pull this off. So just bear in mind that he wouldn't accept the idea that he's in trouble. But I think this is the biggest crisis of his presidency, because he's made an enormous mistake. In the fact that he thought this would go differently, it absolutely hasn't. So he's now fallible. For a long time he looked like infallible and unassailable. And the longer this war goes on, actually the more difficult the situation becomes for him, particularly as it doesn't turn his favor. He's already lost the war in some respects, in terms of moral, political, and kind of the military perspective. And of course he's thrown away Russia's future. And he's now beholden to the warmongers around him, who will keep pushing him and the system in a different direction. Of course, we've seen hundreds of thousands of people flee because they're opposed to the war. They don't want to get drafted into the war. The Russian economy is in tatters. I know it looks like they're actually doing quite well out of oil and gas and everything else, but they've got lots of rubles and nothing to buy with them. And over the next year or so, Russia's whole economic future is going to be evidently deeply damaged by this. And Putin, of course, came into office promising prosperity and stability and predictability, and he's actually brought nothing but the opposite at this stage.
And Masha, let's take President Zelensky. What's his future? How do you evaluate right now? Obviously, he's very popular and very well known around the world, but going forward, what do you think this war will do to his leadership?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, when he started, when the day the war started, the day Russia invaded, Zelensky had frittered away his 83% mandate to something in the high 20s. Yeah. He was a struggling, if not a failing president. He was worried about he was worried about whether he'd get another term, and he was totally focused in February when I was in Ukraine, totally focused on internal political dynamics. The bear at the door, well, we'll deal with it if it happens, but it's not going to happen. So obviously he has dealt with, he has been an incredible leader during this war. His communication skills, his courage, his commitment. He is channeling the Ukrainian people, but he is also inspiring them and inspiring all of us at the same time. What does it mean going forward? I mean, I think that he will continue to be a great wartime leader. I would be surprised if he weren't. He is totally inhabiting that role. We sometimes denigrate or maybe criticize for actors that become politicians, but actually they can call on the skills they need to become the person they need to be for that particular challenge. And I think we're seeing Zelensky do that. And I think he will continue to do that as the war progresses. Although I do worry about the pressure on him. I mean, you can see, if you look at a picture of Zelensky in February of this year and today, you can see, he's not the only president that has aged over time. What I wonder about is, I do believe that Ukraine will win, but I think that, building the peace is going to be an even bigger challenge in some ways for Ukraine and for President Zelensky. I assume that he would get another mandate to lead Ukraine during peacetime, but will he be able to make that transition into, sort of a more, shall we say, I mean, Ukraine is a democracy, and he is listening to the people. I mean, he's channeling them just as they are channeling him right now, and he has made that very clear in a number of his speeches as well. That's in part why Ukraine can't go, even if Zelensky wanted to go into negotiations right now, he can't, because the Ukrainian people are not for it. And he would lose his job in a nanosecond if he moved forward today. So there is this relationship between the people and the president, which is what you want in a democracy. But because it is a wartime situation, there have been a number of steps taken to increase the powers of the presidency, which are necessary and understandable. But will they roll those back, and will he be able to go back to a more peacetime kind of presidency?
Excellent. Okay. Well, great discussion. And we have now some questions. So what do we have, about at least 15 minutes, I hope, maybe 20? Maybe we could go 5 more minutes. Yes.
All right. Hello, my name is Cara Smith. I'm a student scholar with World Affairs Council Seattle. And my question is, how do you see the outcome of this war? Do you think that Russia, and Putin specifically, will ever admit defeat without getting everything that he wants? Or do you think there will have to be some kind of international intervention? I'm just wondering what you think it would take to get him to the negotiating table, or to see an end to the war.
Is there either person?
Either
or
person,
one?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to move things along, as quickly as we can, because we've got obviously a lot of questions there, but it's a really great question. And thank you for being a student scholar. They got a lot of future of the World Affairs councils as well. That's wonderful. I'll give you a clap
Yes.
for being here as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I think when you said an international intervention, it can be diplomatic as well as political pressure. And, I think we're already seeing that. And, the Biden administration has been, pulling out all the stops to bring as many countries on board within the United Nations. And I think that's really, honestly, the only way that we're going to get Putin to give something up, is if he gets the pressure of international, not just public opinion, but also opprobrium. The Chinese, for example, taking a very different stance. India, which is already moving in this direction. And also, honestly, continuing to lose on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's what I think.
That is a pretty critical, but it's going to be international diplomacy when the time comes. But in the meantime, international pressure to get Putin to, basically relinquish hold on Russia, because otherwise he's not going to do it. There is no way that Putin is going to give up on what he's got at this particular point.
Could we go maybe to the next question?
Sure,
And we'll
yeah,
keep going.
yeah.
Yes, please.
And actually, my question is a nice follow-on to that one. Angela Weck, Peoria Area World Affairs Council, and I teach at Bradley University. I teach Russian history. So I've been asked, is Putin crazy? Has he lost his marbles? And my answer is always no, he's rational. He may be drinking only one kind of Kool-Aid, but he is quite rational. But my question is, if he were to be overthrown by his own people, could we be in any way guarantee that the next person would be any less willing to continue this war? Or should we be more afraid by Shoigu or someone else?
Oh, actually, Shoigu might be somebody who might actually end the war, actually, because of looking at the military defeat and acknowledging that. But they wouldn't acknowledge it in a very direct way. Look, throughout Russian history, we've seen ups and downs and, these kinds of, as you know, because you've been teaching it. At the end of the Crimean War, Nicholas I, who was the warmonger, was replaced, he died while he was, the war was still going on, by Alexander II, who was the great reformer, and ended up ending serfdom. Of course, 1905 ended up with the revolution, a failure in war. 1914 and the First World War eventually leads to 1917 and great upheaval. But often, we saw Stalin was replaced eventually by Khrushchev. Gorbachev came in after, the heights of the Cold War. We all, covered him. It's not necessary that we get a warmonger who's going to continue this. It's possible, of course, and also probable if we have an extreme circumstance. And we're seeing the party of war maneuver around here. But that's where it gets back to the last question, the international diplomacy. The more Modi and people like this say this is a time for peace, not war, the tighter the constraint is for Russia to continue this war, the more likely we are to have a different kind of outcome. I don't know if Masha's got a different take on this, but
I think we can go to the next
Over to this side.
Roy Gutman, the Baltimore Council. I wonder, on this same theme, what happens if Russia loses, in the sense that Putin's forced to pull out of maybe even Crimea? What happens to Russia? What happens to the Russian Empire? I mean, especially with the huge losses of manpower that they've had, and equipment, and reputation, and everything else. I mean, can the Russian Empire hold together?
Masha, do you want to take that?
Well, I mean, we've got the Russia expert here,
Yeah.
so I would defer to Fiona on that.
Well, I mean, look, the Russian Federation itself is still an empire,
Yeah,
right? Just
exactly.
like, you know, if you talk to Welsh and Scots and Irish, they tell you that Great Britain and the United Kingdom is still an empire as well. Colonization begins at home. But for the larger reach, Ukraine has always been pretty pivotal. And if, you know, Russia is shown not to be able to keep its grip on Ukraine, it makes it much more difficult then to keep pressure on Belarus, which is, you know, kind of pretty much absorbed, Moldova, the Caucasus, you know, Central Asia. And I do think there starts to be some trouble at home in the Russian Federation, because it's the minorities, the non-ethnic Russian groups who have borne the brunt of this conflict. Buryats, peoples from Dagestan, Chechnya, you know, you see Ramzan Kadyrov already circling the wagons here, and you have to remember that although Chechnya was subjugated by Moscow, Ramzan Kadyrov is pretty much a free actor, kind of a free agent in that you know, space now too. So Russia itself could be in quite a considerable amount of trouble, particularly if, again, Russia is seen to have demonstrably lost in this conflict. And again, getting back to the history question, we've seen all kinds of unravelings over time. But of course, I think we're going to have to, you know, figure out ourselves about how we want to manage that over the longer term. I mean, remember when the Soviet Union was coming apart, George Herbert Walker Bush did the infamous Chicken Kiev speech, which I think you probably covered.
Yeah.
You know, the great worries about, you know, kind of the great unraveling of the Soviet Union, and there would be a lot of concerns about the future of the Russian Federation we'd have to be mindful of. But I think Ukraine is actually showing no more Russian empire. And I mean, and Russia, Putin wants to be the only empire that's surviving. Every other European empire, even Britain, has had to, you know, kind of let go of its imperial possessions eventually. And this is really the kind of showdown over that for Russia.
So how do you manage it from the United States?
Sir, would you mind if we
Yeah, I'd do
took the
that.
next question?
But anyway, it has to be
just keep it
international
moving?
diplomacy again.
Okay, sir, please.
Thank you. My name is Tulsi. I'm a student scholar here. I go to SMU in Dallas, represent the DFW World Affairs Council, and my question is for you, Ambassador. And so one thing that we've talked about over the last few weeks in the midterm elections is why are students either voting or not voting? And one conversation I've had that has stuck with me is somebody saying, I'm tired and I'm hopeless. I've lost hope with either the last two administrations, with the media wars, with what's going on in Ukraine and all around the world. And as someone who has clearly lived through all those things personally and also as a diplomat, have you ever lost hope? Or if you haven't, how do you remain hopeful with everything going on?
That's a great question. Great question.
So, I mean, 2019 was the worst year of my life, both personally and professionally, I mean, bar none. And I won't say that I didn't have some really, really bad days. But you know, I think when you're going through challenging times like that, you really have to dig deep. And I know everybody in this room has had their own personal and maybe career challenges as well, where you really have to kind of, you know, think about who you are and what you want to be, not in the sense of being an ambassador, but, you know, being an upright person with integrity. And how do you accomplish that? And I think, you know, reaching out to friends and family and, you know, if you have faith, I think that is also a great boost to the resiliency that we all need to build, because we're all going to have good times and we're all going to have bad times. And, you know, how do you manage through those difficulties? What I would also say is that whether it was 2019, whether it was another year, everybody's got their year. You know, yeah, I mean, I kind of look around the landscape of the United States and I'm like, oh my God, you know, no offense, Jill, but I want to turn off CNN. I want to hide under my bed, play with the dog. But we can't give up.
Yep.
You know, we are Americans and we need to, you know, pull ourselves up every day and work on our little corner of America. None of us can do everything, not even the President of the United States, but there are small things that we can do to make our country the country that the founders intended and that we want it to be. And whether that is, you know, building trust with neighbors as you're doing a beautification program in your small city, whatever it might be, that builds those bridges, perhaps across party lines, because you're doing something relatively uncontroversial, although serious gardeners might disagree. But trying to find your way of serving this country and serving the American people. I think just by the act of getting involved, one becomes more hopeful.
Thank you for being resilient and bold.
Thank you.
That's true. Okay, oh, hey, Evan.
Hi, my name is Evan Odegaard. I'm a student scholar here with World Boston, and my question is about Putin's motivations. So given the linguistic and cultural similarities between Russia and Ukraine, do you think that Putin is scared that the Russian people will see Ukrainian democracy and start to think that democracy is possible in Russia too? In short, is the existence of Ukraine a threat to Putin's regime?
Look, the existence of any kind of opposition to Putin in any form is a threat to his existence. Look what he's done with Alexei Navalny and people like Vladimir Kara-Murza and pretty much anybody who is trying to challenge him somewhere, putting people in penal colonies, for ridiculous amounts of time. Putin is worried about absolutely democracy at home, and also the fact that, as he is exerting himself over, we were talking before about the Russian Empire, trying to weaponize Russian history, and also trying to weaponize the Russian language by demanding that anyone who speaks Russian identify with being Russia or Russian. All of these are kind of pillars of the kind of political system that he has built. So anyone who tries to basically push against this in any form is a threat. And Ukraine was absolutely a threat. Because Ukraine, filled with a large number of people who did have Russian as their first language, but nonetheless identified themselves primarily as Ukrainian, was wanting to go in a completely different direction. Ever since the early 1990s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, wanting to join with European institutions and basically just saying, we're done here, we're moving on. And after 30 years, Putin thought it was possible to come back in and turn that tide, and it's not. So that is a huge threat. And also the hundreds of thousands of people who are leaving. We've had huge brain drain and the flight of capital and now people from Russia. That's also a threat as well, because people don't want to be part of what Putin is doing in Russia at this moment.
Thank you. I'm looking at the clock, but could we have like 2 more questions, Bill? When do we have to end?
Take the 2.
2, okay. 1, 2. Okay, yes, please.
Hello, I'm Anitra. I'm from the Vermont Council. I'm curious if either of you have any predictions for how the ICC or the ICJ will handle Putin or anyone else involved in the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't really have too much visibility into this. I would just note that the Ukrainians themselves are hoping that there will be a special wartime tribunal for to bring the Russians to account. Obviously, it's too soon yet to know whether that will emerge and be established, or whether it'll go to one of the already established institutions. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing is, from my personal point of view, it's really important to charge Putin, even if it's an absentia, even if he never, spends a minute in jail. But it's really important to charge the people who were at the very top and organizing this terrible war, as well as individuals who have perpetrated many of the war crimes that we have been seeing. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first is to bring justice to Ukrainian victims, to their families, to the country. But the second reason is forward-looking. We need to send a signal to the entire world that this time when we say never again, we mean it. We need to dissuade other authoritarian leaders from trying to take the same path. They too will pay a price.
Jill, the last question will be 2 at once. This gentleman's and Ronan O'Malley's, because he's been shut out at the mic. He's been up and down and he's never opened his mouth. So
All right.
I feel like he ought to have that opportunity. So 2 at once, 1, 2, and then answer both.
Okay.
There were protests against the war at the beginning, and I'm curious if there's any kind of possibility of anybody inside of Russia looking at this disaster and getting rid of Putin. Basically, is there any way to say about Stauffenberg in Russian?
Any
Von
just-
Stauffenberg, the guy who
Von
tried to kill Hitler.
Stauffenberg, who
Von
did it.
Stauffenberg, the guy who tried to kill Hitler.
Very quickly, Putin is
Sure.
really concerned about that. I mean, it's not just because he doesn't want to catch COVID that he sits at those long tables. He's probably kind of worked out how close, the Hitler bomb plot, the bomb was to, Hitler, which was way down, the table. But Putin is absolutely worried about this, no question about it. I think his biggest fear is something like this happening. Because, he's often made comments about the people who lose in these big power struggles get put against the wall and shot, the Mussolini, the Ceausescu, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, for example. So you can be sure that he is trying to root out any kind of threat at home to make sure that that possibility is not there, which also, shows a system out of balance. There's a lot of speculation now about what's going on with Yevgeny Prigozhin, Ramzan Kadyrov, and other people kind of coming forward. Are they still playing for Putin? Are they, kind of trying to draw out others, to see what's happening? His biggest risk comes from his security services. If we think back just very quickly to the end of the Soviet Union, of course, it was the coup against Gorbachev in August of 1991 came out of the security services and the military, worried about, what he was doing to the Soviet Union with the new Union Treaty and all the reforms. And one of the people who took part in that as a young man was General Suvorikhin, which is very interesting. I hadn't realized that until recently when somebody pointed that out. Yeah, and he was a young colonel, and he's the guy who's now in charge of the war in Ukraine. Putin's obviously bringing close the people who were before, because Putin has embraced those hardliners who were opposed to the fall of the Soviet Union. So Putin's got to be thinking about this 24/7.
And sir, your last
Thank
question.
you, Bill. And you, just to mention the brave Russians who are speaking out, we hosted Vladimir Kara-Murza in Houston February 10th this year. Sadly, he was, when he went back to Russia, he was arrested a few weeks later. But Ambassador or Fiona or any of you, Jill, obviously you mentioned Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are very far from being willing to negotiate. But if they are going to do that, any agreement is going to require security guarantees from the West. Budapest Memorandum, 1990s, we gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The Russians might not attack us now as we had it, but we had no guarantees from the West, no effective guarantees from the West. There are obviously big obstacles to joining NATO, besides governance and all the other issues. What actual real concrete guarantees can we give? So Zelensky can't say, well, you won't let us in NATO. They're just going to, we've had 8 years of a Russian-backed insurgency in Donetsk, Luhansk. They'll be back in Donbass. What can you effectively do if you won't give us NATO?
So so there are a number of ideas out there. One of the ideas is making Ukraine into a porcupine, making sure that Ukraine is so fully armed and capable that nobody would want to take Ukraine on. I mean, think Israel, for example. Maybe there would be a bilateral agreement along the same lines as we have with Israel in terms of providing the weapon systems, various other things. That would require great political will on our part. Maybe other countries could also come in. But you're right. I mean, this is a big issue. How can we help Ukraine feel secure enough and Russia feel concerned enough that this doesn't happen again?
Well, this is a fantastic discussion, and I think we have to add, Bill, that this is really relevant right now for domestic politics, because all of this is going to be playing out over the next, 6 months and a
Presidential
year.
campaign.
So it's a very important subject, and really thank you very much, Fiona and Masha, for giving us a lot of information. Thank you. Generation, wow.
They are saying thank you for your service and your integrity and your smarts and your passion and optimism, generally optimistic. Jill Doughtery, Masha Yovanovitch, Fiona Hill, what a pleasure to conclude our very long day with you, and thank you for keeping it brisk. There is nothing for you here is the memoir of Fiona Hill, and Lessons from the Edge is the memoir of Masha Yovanovitch. I urge you to pick up these copies. They are life and policy and so much more. And I hate to end on a housekeeping note, but you will want to know that buses depart DeSales Street at 6 p.m. They'll be rotating constantly through 9. We'll be at Lars Anderson. Tomorrow, there will be breakfast in #It's freezing in here at 7:30. Although they kicked it up about 4 or 6 degrees, so I'm actually sweating a little bit now. But I know some of my panelists weren't. Thank you so much for attending with your ears and your voices. Thank you again, and thank you.